What is your greatest fear? Giant spiders, snakes, death, holding up the line at TSA while you're going through airport security? Whatever it is, do you think you'd be able to face it or the personified version of it if it popped up right in front of you right now? Well, today we're diving into the world of Boggarts, everything about them from the simple to the extremely meta. What does their real body look like? What happens if one turns into Voldemort? Can they embody conceptual fears like darkness? All that and more in today's video. This is a series that explores niche parts of the Harry Potter world, one topic at a time. No detail is too far in the weeds, no fan theory is off limits, and no plot hole is too much of a reach. And let me tell you up front, Boggarts are a fascinating creature in the Harry Potter world, and boy oh boy, do they inspire plenty of weird theories, plot holes, and everything in between. Let me know in the comments what your biggest fear is, or if you'd rather just let me know what your favorite creature is, that works too. And of course, be sure to click that subscribe button if you like this type of stuff. I'm making a lot of it, so I'm sure you'll like some of the other videos that I'm putting out. All right, enough filler. Time to explore the strange world of Harry Potter and the mysteries around Boggarts. What better place to kick off the discussion on Boggarts than with the most mystical part about their lore, their physical appearance, or rather, lack thereof. By all accounts, Boggarts are unknowable. They reside in nooks and corners, in dresser drawers, in forgotten wardrobes. This is J.K. Rowling's description of their habitat and how they are typically discovered, noting that one usually gives evidence of its presence by rattling, shaking, or scratching the object in which it's hiding. Boggarts typically like confined places, but may also be found lurking in woods and around shadowy corners. And just like that, I already have questions, but before I launch into that, let's lay the foundation. If you don't know what a Boggart is, I don't really know why you're watching this video, but I'm glad you're here. Boggarts are monsters that prey on an individual's worst fear, and they do that by shapeshifting into that fear. So, say you're afraid of spiders like Ron, the Boggart transforms into a giant spider. Maybe you're afraid of something more awful like Dementors, like Harry is. It can transform into a Dementor. Speaking of, I have a whole deep dive on Dementors that you can watch by clicking the link on the screen. I'll probably put it there if I remember. If you like this stuff, I'm sure you'll like that video as well. So, back to the topic. I'm sure bringing up more questions, even as I'm explaining the basics of Boggarts, is, half the reason people watch these videos, and I promise I'll get to all of those questions. First, a few more details as provided by J.K. Rowling. A Boggart is a shape-shifting creature that will assume the form of whatever frightens the person who encounters it. Nobody knows what a Boggart looks like if nobody is there to see it, although it continues to exist. The piece to key in on here is that apparently nobody knows what a Boggart looks like. They apparently operate on some sort of Schrodinger's cat type beat where observing a Boggart affects the way it looks. The moment a human sees a Boggart, it transforms into their most prescient fear, foiling any chance of catching a glimpse at its pure form. Note that I'm already making assumptions that it has to be human fears to transform a Boggart. I don't really know if it has to be the case. Maybe animal fears also transform Boggarts. This ultimately brings up the question of a Boggart's purpose in life. What kinds of hopes and ambitions do Boggarts... Okay, maybe that's a bridge too far. At some point, these monsters may just be monsters with no other purpose. But I do think that giving antagonists a purpose makes them feel more real and, in the end, more compelling as villains or monsters. So let's back out on that bridge. What is the purpose of a Boggart? An important question I'll circle back to later in the video, but I'm 5 minutes in this video. I'm already incredibly off topic. There are a couple other physical characteristics that I want to bring up in this section before I get to that purpose, if only to at least mention them for later. First is the comment that they can be found lurking around in the woods, begging the question, what is lurking around in the woods? J.K. Rowling specifically mentions that the creature still exists even when there is no human around to encounter it, successfully predicting my next question. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it transform into your deepest fear? In all seriousness, what form does it take while roaming the woods? Boggarts, from what I gather, don't need to eat necessarily. I don't think they have prey, although transforming into something's deepest fears does seem like something an apex predator would be capable of. No, Boggarts seem to exist only to manifest those fears, meaning that as I come full circle, I don't really understand what they get by roaming around a forest on their own, and what form would that take? At first blush, they seem to derive some sort of satisfaction from scaring people. So why then do they exist in a way where they attempt to avoid humans? Hiding in closets and lurking in the woods is a good way to avoid contact, which could lead to the counterintuitive conclusion that they don't particularly enjoy said contact with humans. I don't know. Food for thought. It might also imply that the transformation a boggart undergoes might be defensive rather than offensive. Boggarts are often presented to the audience as somewhat aggressive, having leapt out of a hiding place to attack some unsuspecting witch or wizard with their deep-seated fears. But what if we're being shown a biased picture? Instead, imagine that the boggart's shapeshifting is more akin to a cloud of ink from a squid, a means of distracting and escaping rather than attacking. Maybe like a butterfly with giant eyes on its wings is a better example, or like shaking a stick at a charging moose or something. Either way, if you reframe the settings in which boggarts are shown, it begins to change the way you think about their motives. And really, I'm just giving you a glimpse of my mental state as I sit in the terminal of an airport writing ridiculous theories, waiting for a flight home. And now I'm recording those ridiculous theories for you to watch. Thanks for watching. But to dive a little deeper into these nightmare chameleons, we need to understand a little bit more about the magic that powers them and its effects. Boggarts are, by all accounts, amortal beings, just like Peeves the Poltergeist or Dementors. From J.K. Rowling's description, like a poltergeist, a boggart is not and never has been truly alive. It is one of the strange non-beings that populates the magical world, for which there is no equivalent in the Muggle realm. Boggarts can be made to disappear, but more boggarts will inevitably arise to take their place. Like poltergeists and the more sinister Dementors, they seem to be generated and sustained by human emotions. Man, I swear every time I read a quote from J.K. Rowling, I'm left with more questions than answers, which is probably why I have a whole channel of videos exploring ridiculous questions that come to mind. So, according to J.K. Rowling, they are not and have never been alive, which would imply that they also cannot be killed, so to speak. She does, however, admit that they can be made to disappear, which, while interesting for boggarts, honestly has more implications for Dementors, which, according to most sources, cannot be destroyed. Though the Ministry of Magic can some way or another limit their numbers. Watch the other video if you want more of that. The more I make these videos, the more I stumble upon these amortal creatures. And honestly, I have a bit of a bone to pick. I will get back to boggarts, I promise, but briefly, it seems to me that these amortal creatures, so poltergeists, Dementors, boggarts, etc., are kind of a cheap fantasy writing trick. They allow the writer, J.K. Rowling in this instance, but it isn't limited to her, to create a character that might not otherwise be all that powerful or unusual, except for the fact that it cannot be killed. It artificially elevates the stakes and the mystery surrounding a creature in a way that can kind of compensate for a lack of storytelling. A creature that takes the form of your fears is interesting, but add a layer of immortality into the mix, and suddenly you have this extremely enigmatic being simply by way of adding this unsolvable problem into your story. If that unsolvable problem is an accident, it's a plot hole. But if it's on purpose, it's a rich tapestry of complex storytelling. Again, not limited to J.K. Rowling. I'm just noticing that there are many creatures and facets of the story that are kind of like this. All right, soapbox aside. There are a couple other interesting nuggets to pull out here. First, the fact that they are generated by human emotion. If Dementors spawn from despair and depression, and poltergeists are spawned by mischief, I see no logical alternative for Boggarts besides an origin based in fear, begging the question of what creatures are generated by all other kinds of human emotion, like happiness, awe, confusion, and this is very quickly turning into a Brandon Sanderson novel. Maybe we'll get to that later. This fear-based origin also implies pretty obviously that they can read minds, but I would also argue that it goes further than that. Think back to the example of a boggart wandering through the woods. I would argue that even though it's not quite the way things are described in the books or in the movies, that the boggart's transformation is less dependent on the boggart and more dependent on the boggee, or the person being boggarted. You get it. It makes more sense to me canonically that rather than the boggart having to read your mind and then transform into your fear, that instead it functions more like a mirror, and that on top of being amortal, they are somewhat passive in the magical world. This would explain quite neatly how no one has seen the true form of a boggart, as anytime a witch or wizard encounters one, even from a vast distance, it might automatically, I wrote the word automatically, it might automatically take the form of their fears. In practice, it might take a couple seconds to transform, but imagine you're walking around a dark forest and way off in the distance, you see a weird swirling shape, some indistinguishable blob in the distance, a disturbance out of the corner of your eye. And then seconds later, you see your biggest fear staring at you from the murk. Admittedly, this makes more sense when you're scared of a giant spider than of your professor, but we can't really solve for everything, can we? And I know there's like holes in that logic there. I'm going to get to them. Before you comment something, just let me keep talking, please. All right. The other critical point to take into account here, albeit a somewhat confusing point, is that boggarts have two major weaknesses. First being the spell Ridiculous, which can essentially one-shot a boggart, and second, a more of a double-edged sword, I guess you might call it. Boggarts take on not only the powers of whatever they imitate, but also the weaknesses. This is not really clear in any example other than Harry practicing his Patronus on a boggart Dementor in The Prisoner of Azkaban. "Another boggart," said Lupin, stripping off his cloak. "I've been combing the castle ever since Tuesday, and very luckily, I've found this one lurking inside Mr. Filch's filing cabinet. It's the nearest we'll get to a real Dementor. The boggart will turn into a Dementor when he sees you, so we'll be able to practice on him. I can store him in my office when we're not using him. There's a cupboard under my desk he'll like." This, of course, has a few very obvious implications and some logical leaps that I'm sure are not going to be the only ones made in this video, and I'm probably not the only one to make them. So let's go down the list. First of all, the most obvious question. How powerful are these imitation powers? There are two, maybe three main references to draw from. By and large, every time we see a boggart have an effect on someone in the books or movies, it's when one takes the form of a Dementor and attacks Harry. And by all accounts, it seems at the very least that they mimic the minor powers of the Dementor that it's impersonating. Lupin grasped the lid of the packing case and pulled. A Dementor rose slowly from the box, its hooded face turned toward Harry, one glistening scabbed hand gripping its cloak. The lamps around the classroom flickered and went out. The Dementor stepped from the box and started to sweep silently toward Harry, drawing a deep, rattling breath. A wave of piercing cold broke over him. "Expecto Patronum!" Harry yelled. Expecto. But the classroom and the Dementor were dissolving. Harry was falling through the thick white fog, and his mother's voice was louder than ever, echoing inside his head. Not Harry, please. I'll do anything. Stand aside, girl. Harry! Harry jerked back to life. He was lying flat on his back on the floor. The classroom lamps were alight again. He didn't have to ask what had happened. So Harry gets knocked out almost immediately, pretty much matching how quickly it happens on the Hogwarts Express at the start of the book, when he encounters the very first Dementor. Contradicting this, however, is every interaction that Lupin has with the Boggart, which immediately turns into a full moon when facing Lupin. When we see Lupin transform later in the book, the effect seems to be somewhat instantaneous, or at the very least takes place the moment the full moon comes into full view, or reaches its apex, or whatever's convenient for the plot. So, that said, we're left with two options. Either the Boggart full moon isn't powerful enough to transform Lupin, or he just dispatches it quickly enough for it not to affect him. So that doesn't really clear things up, it only adds uncertainty into the mix. There's also the third option that would suggest the powers of a Boggart are psychosomatic, meaning they only exist to the affected person. Someone afraid of fire would only be burned in their mind, and someone else standing right next to the Boggart fire wouldn't feel the heat. This would kind of play into the motif that Boggarts and fear are basically the mind killer, but I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence behind this. The third reference point is kind of debatable and outside the main material. It comes from Harry Potter Hogwarts Mystery, which was a Harry Potter mobile game released back in 2018. I never played it. I'm not going to pretend to be particularly interested in it. However, there is one piece of it wherein you, the main character, repeatedly duel a Boggart that takes the form of Voldemort. Obviously not something that happens in the main series, even though it's brought up in a conversation between Harry and Lupin. It's the main reason that Lupin jumps in front of Harry during class before he can face the Boggart with his fellow students. Combined with the effects of the Boggart Dementor, all of this implies that Lupin had some real fear of what a Boggart Voldemort would be capable of. Watching these duels take place in the mobile game, even though this is sort of ridiculous source material, it seems to imply that the Boggart Voldemort is firing off some form of Abracadabra. I mean, it's a green spell that he shoots at you and it drains your life. I don't know how much more of a reference it could be. It wouldn't be a very fun game if he just insta-killed you, but it also would have some pretty disastrous implications for the broader Harry Potter universe if a Boggart Voldemort was able to kill. I have to think that there would be Boggart Voldemorts popping up everywhere if that was the case. All the more reason to think that while certainly they're able to copy powers to an extent, there must be a limit, a cap, a ceiling on the Boggart's effects. That, or it's all in your head, Harry. Before we fully dive into the strange world of fan theories and headcanon, I wanted to provide a little more context behind the Boggart. It's typically not clear when you read a Harry Potter book which aspects have been made up whole cloth by J.K. Rowling and which parts are heavily inspired by other stories. There is some spectrum here from a creature like a Dementor, which is certainly inspired by other fictional stories and mythology, but also has Rowling's own twist on things. to more well-known creatures like a dragon, which may have a couple new elements, but is by and large a dragon. Boggarts seem to be somewhere in the middle, but I get the feeling that unless you are from Lancashire, you may believe that they're completely an invention by J.K. Rowling. But actually, Boggart was actually a pretty general term for a spirit back in the Old English days. It might not have necessarily had the shape-shifting abilities of Harry Potter's Boggarts, but it has always been some sort of malevolent spirit or poltergeist. In fact, I'm not much of a linguistics guy, but there are many different old spellings of Boggart, all pointing back to the same Middle English word for spirit. Buggy. I think it's buggy, or bougie, buggy. Again, I'm not an English major here, but it's not hard to see how that word also transforms into a variety of our words for monsters and demons, like bugbears, familiar if you play D&D, and of course, a boogeyman. This is where I think the true inspiration for the Potterverse's Boggart comes into play. What you'll find when you start exploring these creatures is that often they take a couple elements from different tellings of the same myth or folklore, and they combine them into a new telling. Boggarts in the Old English sense may not have had the shape-shifting ability, and rather than the mindless creatures that face Harry, they seem to have been more like mischievous spirits, often toying with victims, giving them riddles and such before burning their farms down. Boogeymen, by contrast, are shapeless demons that often have those hallmark transformative powers that we see in the Harry Potter series. One other notable thing that you notice here is the Boggarts in Harry Potter don't seem to try to kill anyone, at least not any time that we see them, which completely nullifies a defining commonality with all of these creatures. They tend to have sharp teeth and claws, and they also tend to enjoy devouring children. Possibly the original intention of these stories was to be used to scare misbehaving kids. Harry Potter's Boggarts don't really seem to have any of the same stakes. You could argue that every time they knock Harry out as a Dementor, they're one step away in the process from eating him, but we don't really ever see a Boggart go that far. It might also be the untold reason that Lupin is always there to step in. Either way, it does have me wondering that had the Boggarts been introduced later in the series, after book 4 for instance, if they would have been a little bit more demonic and a lot more dangerous. All of this works towards the reason that I think there are so many commonalities between Boggarts and Dementors, but I'm going to save that for the theory section of the video. And I can't really write any better segue than that, so let's really get into the bulk of it and explore some of the wild ideas fans have around the Boggart. On to everyone's favorite section, the part where we all make up explanations for this now decades-old story. It's fan theory time. Starting with a theory around the origins of Boggarts. They don't really show up all that often in the series. We have tons of mentions in The Prisoner of Azkaban, obviously, but then only one minor scene in Goblet of Fire where Harry encounters a Boggart in the hedge maze. Then, as he turned a corner, he saw a Dementor gliding toward him, 12 feet tall, its face hidden by its hood, its rotting, scabbed hands outstretched. It advanced, sensing its way blindly toward him. Harry could hear its rattling breath. He felt clammy coldness stealing over him, but he knew what he had to do. He summoned the happiest thought he could, concentrated with all his might on the thought of getting out of the maze and celebrating with Ron and Hermione, raised his wand, and cried, "Expecto Patronum." A silver stag erupted from the end of Harry's wand and galloped toward the Dementor, which fell back and tripped over the hem of its robes. Harry had never seen a Dementor stumble. "Hang on," he shouted, advancing in the wake of his silver Patronus. "You're a Boggart! Ridiculous!" There was a loud crack, and the shapeshifter exploded in a wisp of smoke. And after that, there's a minor plot point in Order of the Phoenix where Molly Weasley keeps asking about a Boggart locked in a drawer, but we'll get back to that example in just a moment. The point I want to bring up here is the often talked about connection between Boggarts and Dementors. I know there are some theories out there from channels like Super Carlin Brothers that Boggarts are like baby or juvenile Dementors, that they're the same creature, but I want to propose a different solution. Yes, there do seem to be a lot of coincidences around the powers that Dementors and Boggarts exhibit, but I want to suggest a different reason for those coincidences. Boggarts and Dementors may seem like different versions of the same creature, but that's only from the perspective of the audience, someone who lives outside the Harry Potter universe. And that's because Boggarts were just an early test version of Dementors written by J.K. Rowling. They exhibit many of the same themes because J.K. Rowling was testing the waters, so to speak. She mentioned in an interview from October 2000, so directly after Goblet of Fire was released, that the series was starting to become darker. Something that was somewhat surprising if you can place yourself in the shoes of a reader going from the front half of the series to the back half. Question. My impression is that the Harry Potter books are getting darker somehow. Is this because he's growing up and his readers have to do the same? J.K. Rowling responds, it's really because Voldemort is getting more powerful, but yes. Also because Harry's 14 now. At 14, you really do start realizing that the world is not a safe and protected place, or not always. So, with that context, my theory is that Boggarts were a test, an introduction of a darker theme that came earlier in the process of writing Prisoner of Azkaban. She was easing the audience to the darker side of the universe. And while Boggarts and Dementors are both introduced in the same book, we spend most of our time with Harry preparing to face the real deal by practicing on the imitation. Boggarts are meant to feel and act primarily like Dementors, but only from a literary perspective. It's a storytelling tool from J.K. Rowling, not a world-building, deeper secret connection between Boggarts and Dementors. I might even go as far as to say they were developed in parallel, but regardless, I think one was developed in response to the other. It might not even matter which came first, but I can picture either the Dementors coming first, followed by the need to lighten up the despair a little bit, enter ridiculous Boggarts, or Boggarts came first and didn't quite hit the emotional development that J.K. Rowling was aiming for. Enter a darker, more sinister version, the Dementor. But enough of that. Let's move on to a more tangible discussion. Fear itself. More specifically, is it possible to have no fears? And what are the limits of fears as they relate to Boggarts? On the topic of no fears, I think people mistakenly believe that Voldemort is the prime example and that he couldn't or wouldn't be fearful of anything, and thus Boggarts wouldn't work on him. This is flawed on two fronts. First, just because he's a power-hungry maniac doesn't mean he doesn't have any fears. And second, because J.K. Rowling says so. She was asked about Voldemort's Boggart in a 2005 interview. Voldemort's fear is death. Ignominious death. I mean, he regards death itself as ignominious. He thinks that it's a shameful human weakness, as you know. His worst fear is death. But how would a Boggart show that? I'm not too sure. I did think about that because I knew you were going to ask me that. A corpse, someone in the audience mentions. That was my conclusion, that he would see himself dead. We'll come back to part of that answer in a second, but first, I want to propose another scenario. Sure, maybe Voldemort has a fear of death, but what about someone truly psychotic in a more clinical sense of the word? Like a person who literally can't feel fear. Maybe that's like Alex Honnold free-soloing El Cap, or like this other random medical case I found. It's a patient who has had complete bilateral amygdala destruction, meaning that the little part in your brain that allows you to perceive fear was missing or destroyed. What's fascinating is that the case states that there are still inherent fears not captured by the amygdala. Research has revealed that SM, which is the patient, is not immune to all fear. However, along with other patients with bilateral amygdala damage, she was found to experience fear and panic attacks of greater intensity than neurologically healthy controls in response to simulation of the subjective experience of suffocation via carbon dioxide, feelings which she and the others described as completely novel to them. This means that even in the most extreme cases, there are still deeply ingrained self-preservative fears that override even severe brain damage, leaving a nearby boggart with a variety of evolutionary phobias to latch onto. That said, I also think that the boggart's method of finding a fear is not perfect. We see this in two instances. Once, in our first introduction to boggarts, while Lupin is teaching in Harry's 3rd year. "Seamus!" roared Professor Lupin. Seamus darted past Pavarti. Crack! Where the mummy had been, there was a woman with floor-length black hair and a skeletal green-tinged face. A banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and an unearthly sound filled the room, a long, wailing shriek that made the hair on Harry's head stand on end. "Ridiculous!" shouted Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle. Then crack! Became a rattlesnake, which slithered and writhed before crack, becoming a single bloody eyeball. "It's confused!" shouted Lupin. "We're getting there." The ridiculous spell isn't fully explained, but what you'll notice here is that the boggart isn't being fully dispatched by any one student. Unlike what we see with Lupin later in the series, ridiculous can be cast as a more or less powerful version, depending on the caster's ability, which also means that we can see the boggart fight, so to speak, for its preservation. Boggarts don't just automatically pick any single fear, they can cycle through things that might be generally upsetting until they find something that sticks. Take another example, where Molly Weasley is unable to properly dispose of a boggart. Someone was cowering against the dark wall, her wand in her hand, her whole body shaking with sobs. Sprawled on the dusty old carpet in a patch of moonlight, clearly dead, was Ron. All the air seemed to vanish from Harry's lungs. He felt as though he were falling through the floor. His brain turned icy cold. Ron, dead. No, it couldn't be. But wait a moment. It couldn't be. Ron was downstairs. "Mrs. Weasley?" Harry croaked. "Ridiculous," Miss Weasley sobbed, pointing her shaking wand at Ron's body. Crack. Ron's body turned into Bill's, spread-eagled on his back, his eyes wide open and empty. Mrs. Weasley sobbed harder than ever. "Ridiculous," she sobbed again. Crack. Mr. Weasley's body replaced Bill's, his glasses askew, a trickle of blood running down his face. "No," Mrs. Weasley moaned. "No, ridiculous, ridiculous, ridiculous." Crack. Dead twins. Crack. Dead Percy. Crack. Dead Harry. "Miss Weasley, just get out of here," shouted Harry, staring down at his own dead body on the floor. "Let someone else—" "What's going on?" Lupin had come running into the room, closely followed by Sirius, with Moody stumping along behind them. Lupin looked from Miss Weasley to the dead Harry on the floor and seemed to understand in an instant. Pulling out his own wand, he said very firmly and clearly, "Ridiculous." Harry's body vanished. A silvery orb hung in the air over the spot where it had lain. Lupin waved his wand once more, and the orb vanished in a puff of smoke. What we see in this instance is a more realistic encounter with a boggart. Not a controlled encounter in a classroom, and we can see how they might actually work against a normal witch or wizard. Still, the question that sticks in my mind is, what is the boggart's goal? Is it just to scare people, or is there a hidden part of the story where they do actually kill their victims? I guess if they're non-living beings, they don't really need to eat, but just because something is non-living doesn't mean it can't hurt people. Case in point, Dementors. I don't know, you tell me. But the last question and theory to bring up goes back to an earlier statement from J.K. Rowling, that Voldemort, faced with a boggart, would end up seeing a vision of death. She implies that, in this case, the boggart would take the form of his own body, as that's the most impactful way to show him death. But what about other intangible fears? Can a boggart take the form of darkness, loneliness, failure, change? In many cases, it seems like you could draw a line from that fear back to some feeling of self-preservation and eventual bodily harm. So, does that mean the boggart might just show you different versions of yourself? A lonely version of yourself, a version of yourself looking sad, you getting ghosted, you getting a random unannounced Teams call from a colleague? Maybe for many of those, a boggart could just take the form of you in that situation. I do think that still leaves us with a few base level fears, like how does a fear of darkness manifest? Could a boggart suddenly make the world around you dark? What about a fear of heights or falling? Could it create those feelings without manifesting a physical form? Maybe the answer is that it would just pick a different fear to emulate, even if that feels like a bit of a cop-out. I'm not sure. I kind of wonder if there can be fears too difficult for a boggart to emulate, and so instead, it just picks something a little bit easier or more tangible. The very last theory to discuss is the true form of a boggart. When you look around the internet, the very common solution to this problem is almost always tied to Mad-Eye Moody peering through a wall and being able to see a boggart in its natural state. Unfortunately, I don't think it's quite as easy as that. We see Mad-Eye Moody scope out a boggart in Order of the Phoenix, and his magic eye does it from like 5 rooms away, so I don't really know what kind of limits that thing has. "Oh, Alistair, I'm glad you're here," said Mrs. Weasley brightly, as Mad-Eye shrugged off his traveling cloak. "We've been wanting to ask you for ages. Could you have a look in the writing desk in the drawing room and tell us what's inside it? We haven't wanted to open it just in case it's something really nasty." "No problem, Molly." Moody's electric blue eye swiveled upward and stared fixedly through the ceiling of the kitchen. "Drawing room," he growled, as the pupil contracted. "Desk in the corner? Yeah, I see it. Yeah, it's a boggart. Want me to go up and get rid of it, Molly?" Now, I'll admit that this isn't a definitive answer as to what Mad-Eye is seeing, but I suspect that he isn't seeing some Lovecraftian horror hiding in the desk. He's just seeing whatever his fear is, and I've got 2 guesses for that. He's either A, seeing Voldemort, but like Voldemort crammed into a tiny little desk, or B, he might be seeing himself after what happened in the Goblet of Fire. Maybe, even though he would never reveal it, being impersonated and then held hostage really probably left a mark on him. I'm leaning toward option B, but option A is equally hilarious. Regardless, what I don't think he's seeing is the true form of a boggart. Even though the excerpt I'll read in a second explicitly states that a boggart in its natural state hasn't taken a form yet, if no one knows what it looks like in its natural state, how can we possibly know that it's in its natural state? Here's Lupin explaining. So the boggart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a boggart looks like when he is alone. But when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears. This means, said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, that we have a huge advantage over the boggart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry? Trying to answer a question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet with her hand in the air, was very off-putting. But Harry had a go. Because there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it should be? Precisely, said Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking a little disappointed. It's always best to have company when you're dealing with a boggart. He becomes confused. Which should he become? A headless corpse or a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a boggart make that very mistake, tried to frighten 2 people at once, and turned himself into half a slug. Not remotely frightening. Maybe I'm completely wrong, and this blows open every bit of theory Crafton I was doing, but again, if supposedly no one knows what a boggart looks like, how do they know it doesn't have a form while it's in hiding? Lupin is friends with Mad-Eye. You'd think he would have come up with this idea in conversation. And there is almost certainly a spell that allows you to see through an object. So someone in the wizarding history of the wizarding world must have been able to look into a place where a boggart was hiding. What would they have seen? I guess if boggarts are not some type of Schrodinger's cat situation, then they really do have a relaxed state. The most compelling answer I can think of is that they would just take a sort of inky black void shape, or maybe something like the smoke monster from Lost. Just a generic nothing. But I'll be honest, that's the most disappointing theory of everything that I've gone through in this video. So why don't we all just ignore it and move on to the last section? Everyone's favorite time to complain. Say it with me. I can't go through this entire video without at least bringing up a couple potential plot holes permeating the boggart mythos. So first and foremost, a plot hole that I'm going to call the meta-boggart theory. And it revolves around a single question. Why don't all boggarts turn into the most dangerous thing possible? I've already discussed this idea a bit when I brought up fighting the Voldemort boggart in the Harry Potter mobile game, but there is one point that I want to reiterate. When a boggart chooses to imitate something, it does copy some extent of the power of that subject. I know this will be at least somewhat debated, but from what I can see, the main counterpoint is that when it imitates the full moon, it doesn't immediately turn Lupin into a werewolf. But 2 points on this. A, we don't know that for sure. And B, the moon itself doesn't really have powers. It's Lupin's innate reaction to the moon that's problematic. So, first, we don't really know for sure that Lupin wouldn't be affected by a boggart moon, because every time we see him encounter one, he poofs it out of existence almost immediately. Almost as if he's afraid of what might happen if he just sat there in front of it. Almost as if maybe, just maybe, a boggart moon might actually hold some power over him. Think about when we see Harry practicing with a boggart Dementor. Those are able to knock him out very quickly in the same fashion as a real Dementor. There's nothing to say that if Lupin sat in front of a boggart full moon, he wouldn't start growing a little bit of extra hair and sharp teeth and those weird gangly limbs that the Harry Potter werewolves have. Second, in case that argument fails to sway you, we have to remember that the boggart is copying the powers of the thing that it's imitating. In the case of Dementors, Harry's experience is the same as with the boggart as it is with the real deal, implying the mechanism it uses to attack him is the same. If we think about Lupin, he's not so much being attacked by the moon as he is allergic to it. If someone was allergic to nuts and a Dementor turned into a pistachio, would they need like a magical EpiPen? Maybe that's a bad example, but what I mean is that it's not necessarily copying physical characteristics. If it could turn into a pistachio, I don't think it would literally be made of pistachio. It would just look like one. If it didn't, why wouldn't everyone encountering a boggart be afraid of it turning into like the sun or a black hole? Which brings me all the way around to my main argument. If you can accept that a boggart's powers have some limits and that it's mainly copying magical abilities, sure, it crosses out the danger of it turning it into an existential threat, but wouldn't it still be possible for it to turn into something really, really magically dangerous? And if that was the case, how would you stop everyone in wizarding society from immediately optimizing to that worst case scenario? It's like crowdsourcing the worst possible outcome. Boggarts seem to be somewhat plentiful in the Harry Potter universe, so you'd be bound to hear about something happening a couple houses down. Sure, a Voldemort Dementor would be scary, but what about a Basilisk Dementor? Or maybe a Nundu, which is apparently a creature in the Newt Scamander part of the Harry Potter universe, whose breath can wipe out an entire village of people? What about one of those? If I randomly saw a super deadly creature in the street, I don't think I would assume that it was a Boggart. And even if it was, couldn't it still mess me up pretty badly? And if I was a village over and I heard on the radio or whatever that a Boggart impersonated a Nundu and destroyed an entire town, my first reaction would be, I sure hope I don't run into a Boggart, because it would immediately turn into another Nundu. If every adult witch and wizard knew that a Boggart could turn into something really, really bad, everyone would pretty quickly key in on that really bad thing. It'd be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in my opinion. So I don't necessarily have an answer for that. It just feels like maybe Boggarts in the end are kind of like fake threats. They don't actually pose that much of an issue to adults. But again, this kind of goes back to this problem that I have with these amortal beings. There's no stakes attached to them. So I have to assume that the Boggart actually can be dangerous. And if that's the case, there's some major problems that I feel like most witches and wizards would have with them. But those are pretty much all the opinions I have. If you've made it this far, there's literally no reason not to click the subscribe button. You watched a 45-minute video about Boggarts. Just admit that you liked the content and maybe turn on those notifications while you're at it. Either way, I appreciate it. And if you liked this one, there are a bunch of other videos on the channel deep diving other Harry Potter lore, the lore of series like Star Wars, Game of Thrones, some video games like Fallout or Helldivers. There's a lot to check out. Above all else, the absolute best thing you can do to help the channel grow is to go watch another video. That tells YouTube that my channel is worth promoting to new people, and that helps it grow. There's plenty of other content you'll like. I'm sure there's a couple on the screen right now. Go check them out. With that, thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.